Well, we will now continue that discussion on problematic waste streams with our next panel, which will be moderated by Craig Reucassel. And please join with me in welcoming Craig and the panel for this morning. Thank you. Thanks, Craig.
Thank you, Lina. All right, as they're coming on stage, I'll introduce you to the panel here. We've only got 2 seats. You're going to have to fight for it. All right, we have, next to me is Lina Goodman, who's the CEO of Tyre Stewardship Australia. Next to her, we have Dr. Deborah Lau, who is the lead of Ending Plastic Waste for CSIRO, one of the experts we spoke to for War on Waste. Notice she's saying ending plastic waste, not ending plastic entirely. That was too big a challenge initially. And we've got Stuart Nielsen, the head of strategy from Enviromesh. So I'm going to start by just, if you guys could do a bit of scene setting about what you guys are doing. I'm going to start with you, Deborah. If you want to give us a bit of a scene setter, I kind of guess an overall of what the CSIRO is looking at when it says ending plastic waste. What's the focus there?
Thanks, Craig. So CSIRO has a program of missions which are looking at national and global challenges. We know there's a lot of environmental challenges and societal challenges facing the world, and one of them is the plastic waste crisis. So our goal is to address plastic waste by reducing it in the environment by 80% by 2030, which is a very ambitious goal, but it's really around the paradigm, it's around the way that we operate. And we want to change our relationship with plastic. We want to transform our economy for plastics to a circular economy for plastics. There's a very common acknowledgement and understanding that that is a pathway. And that is even recognised as the Global Plastics Treaty is being negotiated. The fundamental premise underlying that is really addressing the plastic pollution problem by creating a circular economy for plastics, changing the waste to a resource and keeping the plastic in a circular pathway.
Wonderful. Only a small challenge there. Lina, talk to us about Tyres. What is Tyre Stewardship Australia doing? What's your kind of challenge going forward?
Craig, in Australia, we love our cars. In fact, we love them so much that I think that the number is that there's 2.5 tyres for every single person who lives in Australia. That equates to about 450,000 tonnes of tyres that reach end of life each year. You saw the numbers here from Tony today, but nationwide, our recovery rate for tyres is about 64%. And of that 64%, 80% of it we send overseas as a tyre-derived fuel. And I think we need to do more and we need to do better. What the scheme is attempting to do through its voluntary arrangement is use the levy that we receive from some tyre importers, not all, to create markets to advance the use of tyre-derived material here locally. In fact, so far we've committed $9 million to a range of projects that we've seen happen over the last 5 to 7 years, including crumb rubber in roads, including some of the products you'll see at our stand, noise wall barriers, safety locks, T-locks. Rubber is a beautiful product and can add so much value, but we're just not moving fast enough in utilising this material here locally.
Stuart, take us through Enviromesh. What do they do and what are you trying to solve?
Very simply, we take waste plastic, waste polypropylene, industrial plastic, and we turn it into a reinforcement for concrete. That would be footpaths, shared user paths, cycleways. What we're doing is removing the steel, which, as we all know, is has a high usage of burning fossil fuels, and we replace it with a plastic. It's a small, discrete, recycled, 100% recycled plastic, and it actually started life as a PhD project with James Cook University in 2015-16. We started manufacturing around that time in Victoria, and in our first year we did 3.5 tons of recycled plastic. And just finished last financial year, we did 200 tons of recycled plastic. So that's the sort of growth we've had. To date, we've actually used 675 tons of waste plastic. That's about saving about 13,500 tons of CO2 emissions compared to using steel in concrete.
That's fantastic. Okay, so let's dive into this. Deb, I'm going to start. It's interesting because one of the things that comes up when you talk about putting plastic into building products or putting rubber into building plastics, and Deb, you said the goal was to reduce the plastic in the environment. One of the questions that comes up, and one of the pushback you occasionally get, is saying, okay, hang on a second, if we're going to make these beams out of plastic, or we're going to make this rubber crumb and a playground of that, is that you're actually leading to a situation where you're ending up putting that plastic and putting that rubber into the environment there. So I guess, actually I'll come back to you, Deb, at the end of this, but I'll go, in terms of Stuart and Lina, what do you do to prevent that? Like, how much time do you spend ensuring that that's not the end result of what you're doing when it comes to recycling? I'll start with you, Lina.
Thank you. And there's a whole range of different applications first. So if we think about roads as an example, it's not sexy to put rubber in roads. People have been doing it for a very long time. Rubber is a polymer. When it's put in a road, it doesn't actually come apart. And I think we've got to be careful we don't mix this issue around tyre particle wear, which is a problem, and that is associated with the wear and tear of an in-use tyre on a vehicle. Yeah, that is a problem, as opposed to what we're trying to do from an end-of-life perspective, putting that tyres back into a road where it doesn't actually create that same sort of level of microplastics issues. What we're doing about it is we've done a lot of research. We continue to do research to ensure that it's not causing environmental and social harm. And in fact, there's quite a lot that we've done in terms of chemicals of concern. It's on our website, and it categorically does show that when it's in roads and infrastructure like what we're seeing today, it's not going to cause the harm we're associating with the microplastics.
Just because I know that in terms of the products that you look at, I know that a lot do go into roads and products like that. But you also have on your website, you also have things like, sporting fields and playgrounds and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Is that a concern in terms of that contamination, or is, what's the solution for that? And I guess, as you say, what's the comparison of what's coming from that recycled content as opposed to what's coming from just us driving around on tyres in the first place?
And I want to talk about the sporting fields and playgrounds because we're compared a lot to what's happening in Europe. Now, I think that in first instance, we need to see better standards and practices put in place. So if we're creating a sporting field that's utilising crumb rubber, then let's ensure that we put barriers on our drains to ensure that those granules don't disappear down the waterways. In Europe, what's interesting is that because they have a lot of snow and the crumb is in those sporting fields, when they're wiping the snow away, they're taking the granules with it and it's ending up in the waterways. I think a lot more needs to be done to understand and ensure it's not causing harm. But in terms of the work, in terms of infrastructure, I don't think we're saying the same level of consideration.
Stuart, I mean, your product's kind of locked in concrete. Is that the kind of solution there you've got?
Well, it's the solution we have at the moment. It is encapsulated within the concrete. It will actually perform better than conventional steel reinforcement in concrete. That's tested, proved. I've got an experience of about 25, 30 years, both in Europe and here in Australia, of using synthetic fibre as a replacement of steel in concrete. And yeah, it's encapsulated. I think, though, it's still in its infancy. So we're still looking and researching, as Lina says, we're looking all the time for how this is going to work in the future. And I think you actually said in your presentation, you talked about, what we do at the end of life. So what we're trying to do is have a pavement or a footpath or a cycleway that lasts 100 years. And the recycled plastic is encapsulated in that for 100 years. Now that's certainly better than, doesn't matter what you put in the concrete, if it only lasts for 20 years, that's not sustainability in anyone's sense. So there's a lot of education, I think, required, a lot of training around this, and in 10, 15 years' time, there might be a new process, as you said, for extracting the plastic out of the end of life.
I guess that's the question, because in your particular, as you say, it's going to last 100 years anyway.
Yes.
But obviously steel is probably easier to extract from concrete at the end, has a much larger, I'm not saying has a much larger carbon footprint initially, obviously.
Yes.
Are you able to extract the plastic at the end, or is it kind of not able to be done?
Not at the moment. But again, the our industry of innovation is moving much faster than legislation and much faster than recovery. So I think really what's happening is that at the moment we have EPA approval for end-of-life recycling at this moment in time. So if we have a footpath that it has to be taken up for any reason next year, it can be recycled with the recycled plastic in it. And the percentage of plastic in it is so small that it's not of significance to waterways, oceans, etc. But I think 10 years' time, we will probably have a way of extracting that once the technology moves on. Yeah.
Deb, in terms of that reducing plastics in the environment, what role does CSIRO play in, I guess, testing these new products? There's a lot of innovation going on in this area, and I think the difficult thing is you kind of go, well, is somebody kind of testing this to make sure that the long-term, the life cycle of this product is actually beneficial? And as I said, often we'll look at it from I'm solving this one problem of waste. I mean, the thing that did my head in the last war on waste was, we went, oh, it's great, we've got bagasse, we're solving a sugarcane waste product. What's it leading to? It's leading to a PFAS problem later on. You just go, what role does CSIRO take in looking at these new solutions and saying, it doesn't have a long-term deleterious effect?
Yeah, and you're touching there on sort of what is the holistic problem in terms of what are the potential consequences of new materials. And so, we've touched on just previously sort of looking at the potential implications of new ways that materials are being used, new ways plastic are being used, new ways rubber crumb might be being used, and naturally there's societal and environmental questions about what are the potential implications of this. We're moving into new technologies and new materials that haven't been used before. People quite often, we hear them say, are these materials, in looking at new materials, are they going to be the asbestos of the future? So it's a natural and important question to ask, because we don't want to be creating unintended consequences when we're moving into this space. But we're not moving into this space from an uneducated perspective. These industries, these innovators, these developers do understand that there are regulations, there are standards around environmental emissions, and where there's moving into new spaces where those standards might not exist, there is a really rigorous process that needs to be gone through to validate whether that material can be used at scale. So that's why we move from lab scale experiments to pilot scale to larger scale trials, because that tests whether they're going to be those emissions and validates whether those assumptions are real.
It's interesting, because as you say, you need comprehensive testing to be done. That also comes at cost. And that is obviously one of the things that makes it harder for the people who are coming up with innovative solutions. The first barrier is we've got to get over these tests, we've got to get this kind of stuff. I don't know how much a test is at CSIRO or commercial organisations. Is that something where organisations like ecologiQ and where governments need to step in and make those tests cheaper to ensure that that barrier to entry for a new innovation is lower?
I suppose that goes into the cost of labour. It's a question that I can't answer. But the way that we see a lot of research happening is that companies or businesses will partner with research providers. Now, CSIRO is only one of many research providers across the country and beyond. And there are a lot of grants available for these new technologies. So there is support available that reduces the research cost for the business or the investor that's looking at developing these new technologies. So that's really the way that we see most of those cost challenges happening.
Stuart was nodding along. Is that one of the barriers for getting new technology up?
I think so. I think what as I said earlier, we're for a recycled plastic reinforcement in concrete, we're about 6 years in. But Australian standards, global standards, take 10 years from start to finish. So what we're doing is as innovators, maybe agree, is we're moving much faster than Australian standards, the regulations, and everything else. So we're at a point now where our product doesn't have an Australian standard because it hasn't caught up yet. So it is a real barrier to moving on. And we're continually spending good money burning more fossil fuel instead of innovating and moving those things forward.
Daddy, why didn't we solve climate problem now? It's just a bit too much bureaucracy, basically. Then I know we're going to be slow. No, it's more difficult.
Add to that too?
Yeah, can you add to it? And then I've got a question for you, actually.
I want to add to that because it's also around risk, not just about the cost of doing it's also risk in terms of the people in this room and outside of this room that are faced with a challenge that says, do I do the same thing I've done for the last 30 years, or do I actually take this test that tells me if I use crumb rubber, my road's going to last longer and I'll have less maintenance? Should I take that risk? And so I think I'm overdoing this whole conversation of testing of crumb rubber in roads. Well, it should actually be business as usual because we've been doing it for so long. And I think that part takes so long, is getting people across the line to go, I'm the person that's going to put myself, my neck on the line to go, I'm going to try something different.
Which is why I think having a legislative backing does take out some of that risk.
Correct.
It means I have to do this, so this is not a risk
Correct.
question for me. A question for you, Lina.
Yeah.
NTRO report, only 10% of tyres get recovered for recycling across Australia. Why is there such a discrepancy in recycling statistics?
Yeah, and great, and I'm glad someone was listening to me because there is no discrepancy. I think this number tells us what's used in Australia. So of the 450,000 tonnes that reach end of life each year, we are only using 10% of that in Australia in value-added products such as construction roads, whereas we are exporting 80% of everything we collect overseas. So the statistic is right, it's about in-country use.
And also, I mean, the majority, the reality is at the moment that most tyres go into tyre-derived fuel, predominantly
Correct.
overseas.
Yes.
What's the kind of carbon footprint of that? Is that a benefit? I think whenever you're burning something like tyres or plastics, there's a concern about the actual kind of carbon footprint of it.
Yeah, so we've done a life cycle assessment around tyres used as a fuel or tyres used into roads as well. Of course, when you're comparing it with coal, tyres is a better outcome. So when you're doing that comparison, and that's what our life cycle assessment did, it compared tyre-derived fuel to coal. I think tyre-derived fuel, there's a 43% greenhouse gas benefit compared to coal.
It's interesting though that I wonder if life cycle assessments where we're comparing with coal is really the way to go at the moment. I mean, I think if you're hypothetically using tyres, in green steel as as Vina does, you're comparing obviously. At the moment, there's no renewable replacement necessarily
Correct.
for metallurgical coal, so it's fair enough to be doing that. When you talk about energy overall, in Australia nowadays, AEMO says we're going to get to 100% renewable energy or 75% renewable energy. Should we not be comparing with doing it to coal? Should the reality be we need to be comparing with how does this compare with renewable energy?
Yeah, great. And that's a great question. And no doubt the statistics will be very different.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I just want the system changed today. Can someone do that for me? In a room with people that can change things here, just change that. But anyway. A lot of discussion here today has been about how we get these products into the next step of recycling. I'll come to you first, Lina. What are the barriers still? As you say, it's kind of business as usual. You say, we've been putting rubber into roads for years. What are the kind of barriers to getting a higher recycling rate in Australia? What are the barriers to recycling more of it here and not sending it overseas?
Yeah, and I think if we look at, say, for example, the Austroads specifications, if we take roads as an example, they say 18% of crumb rubber can go into the road space. Now, if every road in Australia, local council managed roads, main roads, actually applied that specification in their construction of roads, I think we've done the numbers and it works out to be 180,000 tonnes each year of tyre-derived material into roads. Remember, that's 450,000 tonnes a year. We're getting quite close to utilising our material, but we just don't do it. And the barrier is this whole concept of potentially doing it how we've always done it. We haven't mandated, and to your point, Craig, there probably has to be a point that says, actually, if it works, it's in the specification, then you must do it.
It's just a question there, is because there's obviously a lot of instances at the moment where people are trying to get plastic into roads as well. Are plastic and rubber competing for the same role as the polymer in the road? Is it the same, are you kind of competing against each other there?
Yeah, I think they act as two very different
So it's
components.
a different thing.
It's a different thing.
It's a different thing.
Yeah.
So we can put it all. We can put glass, we can put rubber, we
Yes.
can put
Yeah,
plastic.
they all have
roads.
different functions in roads.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary. That's great. Okay, so at the moment it's business as usual and there's no mandate.
And it should be business as usual, but it's not.
It's just something I wanted to touch on quickly because you mentioned some importers pay the levy coming in.
Yes.
Why do only some importers pay the levy?
Because TSA is a voluntary scheme and not all those who bring tyres in this country wish to participate, and it's 25 cents a passenger tyre compared to our counterparts in, say, Canada. We had the guys from British Columbia down recently where their levy is about $6 equivalent, and in British Columbia the demand for crumb rubber exceeds supply. It got me so angry.
It gets me angry. The word voluntary makes me angry nowadays, to be honest. I've become this mandatory obsessive person. It is extraordinary. I mean, ironically, Tyre Stewardship Australia is held up as being one of the kind of older stewardship programs, and yet it is still voluntary. And how much are we saying per tyre?
25 cents.
25 cents. Huge part of the cost, isn't it? You know, we were looking at blister packs. They're like, well, it could cost 1 cent more for each one of them. You're like, oh God, it's really going to fundamentally change things. Stuart, what are the barriers for you expanding? Is it knowledge? Is it, business as usual? Is it habit? What's getting in the way?
I mean, after me saying that, legislation and standards and stuff are preventing us from doing more, there are a lot of people in this room who have used our product, eMesh, in their infrastructure projects, particularly here in Victoria. But probably the biggest barrier is training, education, looking at the standards, and we're looking further than plastics, because as a company, maybe in 15, 20 years' time, we don't have any plastic, because we've used it all and we don't use it anymore, so we've got to look at something else. So maybe we're looking at natural fibre. I know in Europe they're looking at natural fibres now. They're looking at things like hemp to reinforce concrete. So there's all these types of different scenarios. So the barriers, I think, are just education, people taking a risk. I think when there are so many case studies, we've got 5 years of case studies of performance that works and is successful, and I think people taking the risks. There are some councils in Victoria, one council and the next council doesn't use it. So there's a sort of, that's a training and education thing that everybody needs to start talking about it.
The great thing about recycling in Australia is everybody next to each other has different rules. It makes it really easy to make a national waste program with communications. A question that's come in for you, Stuart, from Anonymous. Feel free to put your name on it. Transport for New South Wales put out an alert on macrosynthetic fibres dislodging from concrete and are under technical review. Keen to get Stuart's insights on this.
Well, that's something I know about. It's apparently it's some shotcrete. I don't think it's certainly not our fibre. I'm going to say that, but look, it's again, it comes back to that training and education thing. Fibres should be encapsulated within the concrete. They shouldn't come out. You shouldn't see fibres. I've been doing it 25, 30 years, and I could show you footpaths, and you wouldn't know there was a fibre in it. Yeah, I can show you the footpath next door, and you can see fibres sticking out. That's just lack of training of the contractor, perhaps applying the product, lack of education, and that's where we come in as a company as well, because we sort of have to take some responsibility in that and offer to train people and to get them involved in making a good job. And it goes back to one of the points I made, which was if you can have a footpath that lasts 100 years, that's much more sustainable than having it last 20 years or 30 years.
Stuart, you're dealing with these, the rules and that at the kind of minutiae level with deal with your product. Deb, are you having that conversation at the bigger level? Is the CSIRO talking to the federal government about how do we change the rules so that, recycling becomes the norm, it becomes the chosen one? Is that a conversation going on in terms of ending plastic waste?
I think those conversations are going on across the country at all levels, across government, across industry, across researchers, because there's such a heightened awareness of the plastics problem. And there's also a recognition that the different sectors also need to be talking and connecting. And we've seen before, earlier today, that reinforcement of the need for collaboration, because different parts of the market need to be talking to each other because they will need to mesh into each other. And those different parts of the market will be impacted or affected by different standards and different policy, different regulation. And the research that goes into developing those new technologies or validating those new approaches or understanding the volumes and flows that are going to be affected, all of those systems need to be speaking to each other. And so when we say that there's no one silver bullet in terms of addressing the plastics issues, it is because we need a whole system of change, and we've talked about, we've heard about the system being, it being a plastics ecosystem that needs to change. And so because there's no one silver bullet, and because there's so much interconnectedness in the system, that conversation does need to happen at a federal government level, but also connected in at a state government level and a local council government level, because just having that conversation isolated at a federal government level isn't going to get the outcome.
Yeah, it's very true. I saw a panel recently with a federal government person talking to a council person, and they were literally speaking different languages. Like, getting that communication is so important. Let's talk about filthy moolah. Let's talk about money and cost and that kind of stuff. It's great to have Stuart on here, because one of the things about this is interesting is often a lot of stuff's commercial in confidence. You don't necessarily get the sense of what's going on. Stuart, I'm going to ask you right now, is your product cheaper? Does it have a cost advantage,
It has a cost advantage. It has an overall cost advantage.
What kind of cost advantage do you think you need to overcome those other barriers? Which is like, if you're 5% cheaper, people are like, it's more hassle to go through this kind of... how much cheaper do you think you need to be for people to go, okay, it's willing to go through that
I think it needs to be cheaper, only just cheaper. Mm-hmm. But I think it also needs to be easier to use. I think it needs to be safer to use, and that's what you get with a fibre in a concrete footpath. So if you think about a concrete footpath, if it's conventionally reinforced, you have to come in the day before, you put down bar chairs, you have to lay the steel on the bar chairs, so you might have to, depending on the size of the project, you might have a week's work before you actually pour the concrete. You're also having to then transport the mesh on a wagon, which is fuel. You have to store it. You have to secure it if it's on the side of a road in a local council footpath. Somebody's going to come along at night and steal it for their project. So you've got to have site security.
Stuart's the one stealing it, just so it makes it more cost-effective on his product.
I hide it, yes. But yeah, so it makes it safer. It makes it easier to use, because the e-mesh or the fibre comes in the concrete, ready from the concrete plant, ready to use on the footpath. So it makes it easier, and that's easier, safer, cheaper, and more cost-effective is making it cheaper.
It's interesting, as you talking through that, it kind of, it harks back to some of the earlier conversations today, which is that, you have to tell the whole story of why it's cheaper. It's not just a question of going, hang on a second, your product's more expensive per metre squared, but then you actually go, but hang on a second, if you take out, there's less labour, there's less fuel. Is that part of the difficulty of telling the story of the cheapness, is you've got to kind of be showing them the whole life cycle?
You have to tell the whole story. But look, it's like we go back to that same thing. We keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. Unless we actually change our mindset, and we have a bit of a connection between councils and state government and federal government in the whole policy, then we are going to continue to keep doing the same thing.
Lina, what's the cost barrier, I guess, in terms of tyres? As you say, you're getting, 25 cents? If you were getting $1 a tyre, would it make it easier for you to make that product cheaper and be more of a lay-down misere, or do you think it's other barriers there?
No, I think it's other barriers. And interesting, a conversation we had recently in WA with the WA main roads people there had indicated for the first time ever that crumb rubber in roads actually made the road cheaper at that point of procurement, which is excellent, and I've not heard that before. I've always maintained it's pretty much cost parity. Whilst I love this whole idea of looking at the life cycle of the product, we know that crumb rubber in roads makes that road last 50% longer than a traditional hard surface kind of road. Those are reports that have been around through the US in Australia for a really long time, but it's hard to convince someone that these, believe me, it's true. Put this in the roads and it'll last 50% longer. Our best organisations that do that are local councils themselves. You know, we did some work with Melton City Council recently. Now, they're big advocates for using crumb rubber in roads because it's saved them enormously in maintenance cost. They're not fixing up cracking. So for them, they've made it business as usual because there's a true cost to their organisation as a result.
It's an interesting thing. Do you think that long-term cost, though, is factored in enough? It's like the EV question. You kind of say, hey, they're more expensive now, but they're massively cheaper to run, and there's no, you know, that last longer, that you don't have to go take them to mechanics and that kind of stuff. But people tend to look at the upfront cost. Is that a similar barrier when it comes to...
I think so. At this point in time, it'll potentially change. And maybe as a stewardship scheme, if we were mandatory, we could actually take that risk away for council so that they could take it up front.
There was a very good question that's gone, but I think I can kind of remember what it said. It was, again, from Anonymous, who's Anonymous is very engaged, I've got to say. Congratulations, Anonymous. It was quite a good question, though, because it said, obviously, this, you know, we're talking today about making recycled products what you're aiming for. But the question was, well, what about if I've got a sustainable product that isn't recycled, but that it's got a benefit from a sustainability perspective? Obviously, you're saying this is so much more better overall, and if it can be recycled at the end of it, how does that product get factored in to this whole process we're talking about here? Which is quite a good question. Deb, I'm going to ask you firstly on that. So we, you know, how do you balance that question of going, yeah, you can recycle that bit of whatever it is, but there's actually something that's a new product that's actually got a much better carbon footprint, it's going to last longer, it's far better. Is that kind of something we should be factoring in here as well?
Yeah, I mean, we're coming back to sort of that systems dialogue. So if I look at an example in the plastic space, you know, there are new renewable plastics that are made from renewable sources, sometimes called bioplastics. We term them bio-derived because that's quite different from where they might end up at the end of the plastics, their use. But they're an alternative to fossil fuel-derived plastics. They're only available currently or in use. They're only sort of 1% of virgin plastics, but they are a renewable resource and they're a part of the system feeding into new plastic products. Now, they're an alternative to recycled plastics. And so when we think of the plastic cycle, we have a number of different inputs and a number of different outputs. And the inputs can be substitutes or alternatives to recycled content. So we have to think of the entire system when we're looking at reducing our plastic footprint, because the whole plastic, the issue around plastic is you know, multifaceted. It's not only the environmental impact on terrestrial and marine environments and marine ecosystems, it's also CO2 footprint. So we know from studies that bio-derived and renewable plastics have 1/3 of the carbon footprint of fossil fuel-derived plastics. We know that mechanically recycled plastics have only half of the footprint of fossil fuel-derived plastics. So they all have a part to play. And when we say that, again, that there's a systems response is needed, it's not just recycling, or it's not just alternative or substitute materials. It's not just reuse, which is on the waste hierarchy, a preferred approach. It's actually all of those things, and there's significant studies and a lot of modelling that actually shows that no one single element of response, like just having renewables or just having recycled content or just changing behaviours, none of those individual responses is actually going to get us to the collective outcome that we need in terms of scale and reducing the overall footprint of plastics. So we need all of those solutions, not just any one in isolation.
Don't get Deborah and I started on bioplastics. This will be a 3-hour session in the end. But I mean, bioplastics are a fascinating one because it's obviously suggested as an alternative. And I know overall it can be ahead. I'm obsessed by kind of life cycle assessments of bioplastics, and amazingly, sometimes they come out way ahead, sometimes they come out worse. Sometimes it's got a worse carbon footprint because if you're cutting down a forest to put in place corn in America to bring out to Australia to turn into a bioplastic product that then has, which waste stream do we have in Australia for bioplastic product? complex thing. And I guess that's the interesting thing about having a system where you have an organisation like ecologiQ who, it's not just you've put in place a set, you have to hit 30% no matter what. It means you can actually look at it on a case-by-case scenario and go, hang on a second, in this case, that's not necessarily better, which is, I think, a much better approach to that. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to your plea to whoever, you can choose whoever you want in the audience, really, because, you know, you've got legislators here, we've got people, building companies, got that kind of stuff. What's your plea for what's the change going forward that you think would make a big difference in your area? I'll start with you, Lina.
3 things. First is the use of crumb rubber in the infrastructure projects are not new, and we plead you to make it business as usual because it should be. The second is when you're procuring Tyre-derived material, please do so from those organisations that are accredited with our scheme, because when we're voluntary, lots of dodgy operators enjoy creating product and causing havoc. And the last one is this whole concept around considering a mandatory approach to not only utilising Tyre-derived material, but also be part in the conversation around microplastics. So if we're going to create products, be part of the conversation with us to help us understand how to put standards in place so we're not causing environmental and social harm in the future.
I've got an advertising slogan for you. It's be more crummy. Is that
Oh my God, I love it. I've actually never heard that before.
There you go.
Thanks.
Deb, what would be your, what would you be asking people to change? Where do you think we can make that big change?
Yes, but I think, state governments are a critical part of the system. But one of the things that we've seen is causing, challenges or disruptions in the system is that different state governments will respond in different ways. And so I think consistency and that dialogue across different governments, state governments and territories, across the different, that lateral level, but also vertically, so with state governments and with federal governments. So there is consistency because one of the challenges that most people have experienced and have expressed is that there's different regulations that they will be bumping into. So businesses that operate on a national scale need to have some consistency.
Yep, different in every state. Stuart, what would be your
Look, I think that I would agree with my fellow speakers that exactly that, and I think more consistency across not even just state, federal, council, but even the person that's sitting next to you in the council office. If I can be controversial, that they don't talk to each other. Different departments within councils don't talk to each other. It's like you said, it's not joined up at all. I think that we're all part of the same industry and we're all part of the same planet and we're all looking for the same thing. And I think what we get is Lina sort of broached on it, that a lot of people think that we're out to get them or give them a product that's not working, or some of the questions there were, how do we overcome, one of them was, how do we overcome subbies not wanting to install fibres in a mix because it's difficult to vibrate? Very niche question from the same anonymous who's asking all the questions. But that's a very niche question, but it's sort of, that's an education thing and a training thing. Come and talk to us and say, how will we overcome this? And then we, as a team, collectively overcome it, rather than saying, well, how are you going to do it?
It is extraordinary how you can sometimes, we were tracking solutions from, this amazing discovery and going through, and it literally will come down to the tiniest decision being made by a tradie on a job that means it doesn't happen. And that's the kind of, we've got to get that whole cycle right. Yeah. And by the way, congratulations, Stuart, for not just answering by Enviromesh as the answer to the solution. So well done.
Okay.
That showed enormous restraint there from
fine.
Stuart.
You just answered it.
Yeah, there you go. It's been a fantastic panel. I think it's really covered so many questions today. So please thank Dr. Deborah Lau, Lina Goodman, and Stuart Nielsen. Jeez.